Another round of applause to our first panelists. And moving it right along to our second panel, which is probably my most favorite of the day, why sustainable transportation is now more crucial than ever. As we know, pollution levels decreased a lot at the beginning of the corona crisis, and now we're back up to record high numbers. So in this discussion, we hope to get some more insights and answers on this. And we have our interim head of people and culture and chief of staff, Julie Chiribu, leading this panel.
Everybody, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, perfect. I have the pleasure to pick the brains of these three great panelists today. And as I'll introduce them, they'll join me on stage. And I will start with Silvia Fischer. Silvia is Vice President Smart Mobility at FreeNow, where she joined in 2020 and supported the transition from a pure ride-hailing operator to the leading mobility as a service platform in Europe. And since then, FreeNow has rolled out over 100,000 shared mobility vehicles in 4 categories and 9 European countries. And they offer e-scooters, e-bikes, e-mopeds, and car sharing alongside taxi and private hire vehicles. And they give everyone the possibility to freely and conveniently choose their best mobility option all in one app. Silvia, welcome.
Good morning.
Next is Dr. Maya Ben-Dror. Dr. Ben-Dror has been devoting over a decade on sustainable mobility from public, private, and third sector working in 3 continents. At the World Economic Forum, Maya leads sustainable automotive and mobility work, including the Global New Mobility Coalition, the Scaling Automotive Fleet and Infrastructure Finance, the Circular Cars Initiative, Moving India in Emerging Markets, and Last Mile Ecosystem. Maya holds a PhD in Dynamic Transportation Policy and Technology Transition and a cum laude Master in Environmental Change and Management from the University of Oxford. Welcome, Maya. And last but not least, let me introduce you to Anders Wall. Anders is COO, Deputy CEO, and he leads investor relations and ESG at GreenMobility. GreenMobility is a 100% free-floating electric car-sharing platform in many of our northern European countries, such as Sweden, Finland, Denmark, but also Belgium, and since a little over a week in Germany. And GreenMobility aims to enable sustainable driving and help reduce noise, pollution, and congestion. And they're one of our dear customers. Welcome, Anders. All right, nice to have you all here. Before we start, I would like to get a sense of what our audience is actually thinking and also behaving like when it comes to this particular topic. And I guess you'll help me to gauge the responses here. So everyone, raise your hand if your main mode of transportation is your own car or vehicle. Okay. Keep your hand up if it's an electric vehicle. Okay. Raise your hand if it's public transportation that you use mostly. Okay. Raise your hand if it's your bike or if you're walking. Okay. And raise your hand if it's shared mobility that you use. Okay, interesting. All right, so we've got some live data here, and we also have the data that we heard earlier from the IPCC. And just like Amber just said, we have had a reduction of emissions at the beginning of the corona crisis, but now they're actually back at a record high. 72% of transportation emissions are the result of traffic. Let's maybe start with you, Maya. Let's try to understand here, what does that data tell us, and what does it tell us about the urgency that we're talking about here?
Wow. Well, obviously, this was just a blip right? This was a blip in terms of emission reduction, but it was also a peek into how mobility can look like, how our lives can look like. And I think the panelists in the panel before us have discussed a bit the issue of public space and how we can repurpose it and put it to a better use that builds a community around it. I'm regretting to see that about out of the almost $300 billion globally invested in recovery for transportation, only about 40% is put into sustainable mobility. We can do better. And I think that the European Commission specifically is doing as much as it can to actually go that extra mile and make sure that when we build again, I don't know if I should use the word better, but we do it in a way that will bring us to a more sustainable future. What I also want to note, if I take this opportunity,
Sure.
is that mobility is essential. We've heard this at the outset of our meeting today. It's essential for social activity, for economic activity. It is an engine for many countries, for socioeconomic growth, but it comes in a great cost. The way that we've shaped mobility to date, and the numbers are speaking. So we've talked a bit about what we need to achieve by 2030 or beyond, but there are quite a few projections that I think are interesting to note. For example, 78% increase in deliveries in cities is what we're going to see by 2030. And we see urbanization still happening, globalization, obviously. All of these have great consequences. And therefore, the urgency to act and to reshape is now. And the pandemic has offered us one positive thing, perhaps, and that's a wake-up call, sort of shaking us a bit and saying, well, we can do better. We can act, and we should act.
Okay.
And last point, technologies are here. We have shared, electric, connected, autonomous. All of these technologies are here. If we bundle them, instead of having 2.5 billion cars by 2050, we can have 500 million cars. Instead of emitting 4,700 megatons of carbon from the mobility sector by 2050, we can slash that by 85%. But only if we take all of these technologies and we integrate them and we work collaboratively.
Thanks for that, Maya. Let's maybe stick to the behavioral side of this. Looking at you and us, for instance, and your experience as an operator, what have you seen in this last decade of changes, and also what do you think will happen when it comes to the behavior of people using mobility services?
Well, I think for one, we've gotten much more options in terms of mobility. If I go back to when I turned 18 and got my license, there were only a few options available, so it was obvious to have my own car. But today, for young people, for all of us, you have a multitude of options, from kick scooters to much more public transport, shared solutions, and so on. So that has changed. But as we heard in the presentation earlier today, it's also led us to consume more, to go further and go more often. So there's definitely a catch on it. I think what we see, especially among some of our customers, is that they are more conscious about what type of mobility they have. They are definitely much more conscious about having shared mobility. I think it's great to see so many in here using shared mobility. Maybe slightly biased here, but that's definitely a trend we see. So awareness of what I'm doing, but also how I'm doing it and where. So it's accessibility. But I think an overall sort of overlying theme is also change of habits, which is what we need fundamentally. And during COVID, we were forced to do it. Now I would like to see that we continue just doing it by our free will, but reality is that so many people fall back into the old habits. It's fundamentally extremely difficult to change your habits.
Yeah.
And it's so convenient to have your own private car with the radio settings done and all.
Yeah. But how do we change that? How do we change that behavior? Maybe you can say something about that, Silvia.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's twofold. I mean, we've just heard about the role of cities, and I think that's absolutely important. We've seen by example of Paris, for example, how possible it is. Yeah? All of a sudden, there are more bike lanes. All of a sudden, there are restrictions to like speed limits, etc., to entering the city. So, of course, a lot have to be done from the outside. The second perspective is the offer. And I think we see so much more offer, so many more options now. The entire rise of the share mobility, digitalization has facilitated apps that make it just possible to link the services. And actually, that's where we come from FreeNow, obviously. So we try to really create a full MaaS platform which allows to really deeply integrate this entire environment. The idea is that the customer can really just with one single app book all the services. So you go out of your house, you find 3 different car sharing cars, 3 different scooter providers, 2 bike sharing providers, and you can just hop on any of these. That should be the idea. So make it as convenient as it possibly can from the exploration throughout the entire experience, traveling from A to B, and payment as well included in one app. And I think there we are in a good position, but a lot has to happen. So for example, we also need to include the public transport in that, because that makes up for like actually 70% of the mobility behavior. And we've just heard that the shared mobility makes just a small share up to now from the general usage.
And we also have the challenge of time, right? So that's something that we all are facing. We saw this in the beginning. We only have about 10 years, if at all. How do we make sure that that happens at the pace that we need it to be happening?
I mean, one big issue, again, we talked about the technologies already being available and its scale, even electric vehicles. This is the year is marked, and we've just seen it, Mobility. It's very clear that the solutions are here, from shared to electric to connected, and maybe autonomous is lagging a bit behind. But then that integration will take a village. So very true, the end user would have to have enough information about the impact of each one of the choices, and they should have all of these choices available within a similar amount of convenience at a reasonable cost, and so on, in order to make that choice, conscious choice. Same goes for cities, and we've heard in the previous panel, cities cannot really probably regulate well without having a good feedback loop over what is the actual impact of in every certain regulation. We can make assumptions, old school assumptions, and then let it continue for 5 years, 10 years. We can afford that now with the time constraint. We have to talk to each other, cooperate. Sort of public sector and private sector have to come together, share the data constantly, information, feeding, try to test and work it out together. And move upwards from pilots. Until now, we've been discussing pilots. So there were some collaborations, and I've researched intensively China, and we've seen corporations in China collaborate with the cities, feeding them with the information they needed to control traffic better, to have better results in terms of emissions and congestion and so on. But these were all pilots. We should scale, and obviously China is a very specific context. We haven't really seen as much collaboration. Here, pandemic has offered some. We've seen Uber, FreeNow, other players collaborate with the public sector in providing complementary services more seamlessly. But one last point on time is that each one of us work at a very different pace. Cities usually have a very slow pace. Regulators, the public sector in general, academia has a very slow pace. And we're now seeing more eagerness to change that. And just in the panel before us, we've had the city of Hamburg, and we've seen, a new title for an institution. It's not just transportation, it's mobility transition. That signals that there is an interest to be more agile at the public sector front. Just one example. If we all move at a closer pace, we'll actually be able to work together more seamlessly. I think that's one of the big items I think we should work on. Speed up, work together.
Okay, so working together, especially to create infrastructures and offerings that enable people to actually, or lead people to actually use the technology that is there. What about the other side? So the education piece of people, making them, aware to that urgency of sustainable transportation. Do you think that we need to do more there, or what's your take on that?
I think we have to motivate people generally. I mean, if we want people to change behaviors, which is fundamentally what we need to motivate them. We've seen many examples of EV subsidies across Europe and across the world, which has led to a steep increase in EVs, which supports sustainable mobility, which is fine. But there's also been a steep increase in production of these vehicles. But interestingly enough, if we can agree that shared mobility helps on the sustainable part as well by reducing number of vehicles in the city, I'm still missing to see what should be the benefit for me to pick you up going to work.
Yeah.
I get the company of you, but
What
besides
else?
that, but I get between 4,000 and 9,000 euro subsidy on the EV that I bought, but I still own a private vehicle. So how do we motivate? Should there be an incentive of some form to motivate us to do a shared vehicle or pick up even two people more going into the city? So we have less vehicles. Then we're truly making a sustainable impact. I think we have to have those kind of things for people to really change, because otherwise they still have the alternative, which is sitting in front of their house.
What would be such incentives, Silvia?
Well, I mean, our vision to that is to be totally customer-centric. Yeah? So we rolled out that multi-mobility offer in 12 months. So what you can find on the app right now is still a first version, and it's already much more integrated and much better. But of course, that's not the ending point. So we really aim at having a fully customer-centric perspective. There should be all kinds of possibilities to tailor mobility offers, which are out there in the city already. But on the app, they should be finally really tailored to your actual needs. If I have to go with my kids in a suitcase, then obviously I'm not going to take a shared bike. However, if I commute to work, I will. Yeah? And if then all of a sudden the weather turns bad, maybe I might opt for a car sharing mode afterwards. Yeah? And it should be really all possible to filter down. We will work with external data. I mean, currently launching a pilot on weather forecast already, which helps you understand what's the forecast. Also, like traffic and congestion data makes really a big impact on mobility choices, and we see really a lot of smart data support to be really customer-centric in the future.
Okay, so these would be things that you would integrate into the app in addition to the offering itself.
Yeah, totally. I think that's where we have to move. It has to be fully convenient to the customer, because in the end, transportation is nothing which is exciting to the customer. It's something which has to work. It's a commodity. Yeah, and therefore, we really need to be super smooth, and the choice need to be logical, and sustainability built in also needs to be just the most logical choice in our view.
I'd like to build on that and say, you know, it's not just the information that needs to be available, and obviously companies that are taking the extra step to make that happen is well appreciated. But I think also, for example, Google Map, if you would have more options than what you have, or that will be prioritized differently, maybe that will nudge behavior. Maybe if you go on a shared ride app and seeing the most sustainable option first rather than the one that they prefer would work well. Then corporations that are large employers in Europe, for example, are accounting for about 70% of emissions. You as an employer have an obligation to provide more options that just give what we call a candy car to your employees that is incentivizing them to drive more miles. And we've seen it, the numbers show that people drive more miles if they have a company car. And then the cities, we talked a bit about how does the city make each mode, the more sustainable modes, more convenient, more accessible, and this was covered really well in the previous panel. But I think one more point to say about the role of the regulator, you know, there are economic regulations and regulatory regulations. So there are economic policies and regulatory policies. And the economic one is a tough one to make, I think. Public space is one thing. How do you change that? I think people see it. It's in front of your eyes and you can see the impact. But then changing the cost of mobility to reflect the actual impact of each mobility option will take a lot of bravery, a lot of political will. It's not very much aligned with how political decisions are being made today, and we all know in different sectors, in different elements of lives. But we do need to make sure that when it happens, we don't object, we don't reject as end users. We should see the bright side. And with the forum, at the World Economic Forum, we're trying to bring together the public sector, private sector together, have these dialogues, prepare the ground for consensus-based actions, and for sensible, effective actions. And we're having knowledge partners that will feed us with the right type of information so that we can actually make progress towards that end. It's not an easy task, but it has to happen. We really don't have the time, back to the point of time.
Anders, your fleet is already 100% electric, right? So what would be the next step in your case to add to this goal of sustainable transportation?
To me, I think it runs in different verticals. One, obviously, as we were talking about before, having more customers driving together. Technological, it's not a problem, but it's a mental barrier. Do I want to get into a car with someone I don't know? So there's this psychological barrier still. So I think it also ties very much into the data to give that information. What am I actually contributing? By doing this, I'm helping to save X number of CO2, reducing so and so many cars. So I'm actually doing something good by taking this mobility option. But that's definitely the next step, that we need to utilize the assets even more, even though our car will drive more trips per day than an average private car. We still need to put more people inside. Then obviously as a green-focused company, it goes sort of 360. So we focus on what do we do with our vehicles once we're done with them. How are they produced? I can't impact the factories still, but I don't have a big enough fleet yet. But it's definitely something we engage in dialogues with. The damaged cars, how do we ensure that we can reuse as much as possible? I think that's a natural part of running an electric car sharing business today. It's not only the car, and obviously it's the electricity we put into the car as well. I think it happens in so many ways, and it's something we need to continue to push the development and combine with data, so we can inform our customers the impacts that they're making by choosing that option rather than their private car.
I wonder if, me as a human being, I look at all these different options that I have, and I consider going to work in the morning, and I have free now. I have GreenMobility, for instance. Being overwhelmed by all these choices also could be a factor that I would not choose any of them, especially if I have to, walk a couple of minutes outside of my house, and I would rather choose maybe my own car that is standing in front of my house. And obviously there has to be some element of convenience there, but I wonder, when is there a cap? When do we say we have to somehow force people to change behavior and kind of go into that direction because of that urgency that we're facing?
So you're talking about whether we should force people to
Right.
act, or we should motivate them.
Yes. So
I would always prefer the carrot. I think it's a free choice, but of course make it more difficult to utilize your private gasoline car.
Okay.
And I think we see this. We see zero-emission areas popping up. We see London is going to announce some of the extension, the long-awaited extension of their regulation. Other cities around the world are using that access regulation. So it's not a direct stick. It's not that somebody's taking money out of your pocket, but it is an access issue. So now you'll have less opportunities to reach your final destination with one mode, if you're using a single occupancy car, for example. So you would actually have to transfer to a more efficient mode, and that usually happens gradually. So it starts with a specific street that has access regulation, or a specific mode, for example, deliveries. We see more cities more keen on starting with delivery vehicles, and rightly so, I think, and then it extends. But I'm completely aligned on carrots being a huge tool, and also innovators that are proposing these new options, new ideas that don't come with a huge compromise on the end user. What I also want to note is, we keep talking about, I'm as a human, but we also change. I mean, there is a period in your life when you can actually be more flexible and agile in the choices that you make. You can work differently. Then there is a period in your time that perhaps you have a family and you need to care for. So then your trip has to break down into 3 segments because you have to go shopping and drop a kid somewhere and come back. And then you go back into that period where you're a bit more flexible, a bit more agile, but maybe also a bit more locked into what is convenient to you. And we need to recognize that we all change. And therefore, the option that perhaps you now prefer would not be the option that you will prefer in 5 years or 10 years. Just be mindful as an end user. And that perhaps will also increase your level of empathy towards, fellow users and to the right of way by which we use, public space. And maybe one anecdote, just like a number. I feel like numbers are usually helpful. There is a study done by North American transportation authorities that says that 95% of public space in cities can be freed up if access regulation is well exercised. So then, when you think about it, wow, 95% of public space currently is not available to me, but it will be available to me. It will have health consequences, mental health consequences, positive consequences on me, on my neighbors. And you just think about that, all the green space we can create, all that fun space, all of these, outdoor parties or whatever makes you smile. And that's, the opportunity is great. We should think positively. We should think carrots.
Okay. I am looking at the audience, and I wonder if there are some questions that you would like to ask our panelists. So maybe we can use a couple of minutes to do that. Yeah? Do we have a microphone?
Just speak up.
Yeah, we can. Okay, there is a.
Hello. Could you talk a little bit about prioritization as we think about the different trade-offs that both private sector operators and public sector operators need to make in order to balance sustainability against public space management, equity, sort of all of these other priorities that the public is asking for? How do you sort of manage making sure that if everything's a priority, nothing's a priority? How do you run counter to that idea?
Who would like to take that one on?
I love that point, and we actually had a conversation before this panel about that. And I think that one big challenge that we as a society created now, I think, is we really create these huge soups with so much that has to come in. We have to include equity and inclusivity and many other elements in each conversation we're having, and then it dilutes what we're trying to get at. And it's very hard. It's very hard to communicate that you actually want to focus on just one thing right now, and this is how you are prioritizing in order to be more successful in your actions. It's a very tough. I think it's a great question because it's a very tough thing to do. And I think this is where some countries that perhaps are less on the democratic side have been very successful, because they can actually have very clear prioritization and go about that quite swiftly. And we're sort of in this mud of let's try to do everything at once and let's not forget this or forget that. So I appreciate that point. I think we should all encourage, as voters and as users, we should encourage decisiveness.
Thank you. There was another question here. Here at the front, and then.
Who's the best one? Hi, nice to meet you. My name is Max from UBKI. My question goes a bit towards electricity and maybe to Anders, particularly as I know you operate a multi-country electric fleet. And I guess you know best the problems that come with scaling that. So I would be curious to hear a bit about looking at these different countries and how the charging network maybe there works, for example, or the whole infrastructure topic. What works well, what doesn't work, and where would you never go because maybe there is, some problems. So I would be just curious if you could share something, maybe also the others, on that electric angle, because that's usually different to a classical ICE car, and the decision factors that then go into going to new markets, for example.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I would hope and dream that within EU we have a common framework for rolling this out. Reality is that we're very far from it. There is a consensus in EU that we should have electrification, but it's carried out in so many different ways. And it is one of the big barriers when we are crossing country lines that we need to sort of reset our platform. We need to look at it in new ways every time. So it can be a public, it can even be a state-owned charging operator, it can be different versions of private ones, it could be charging base, it could be free standing around the city. So working with that, adapting to that, I think is a huge challenge because there's not one framework. The same goes for parking. You have some places you have free parking for EVs, which obviously I think is a great thing. but it's also encouraging and motivating for this change. Some places you have advantages as a car sharing, whether it's station-based or free float, and others you're almost frowned upon that they don't like your service. So I think that's definitely a challenge in rolling this out and scaling it fast enough. We've tried to sort of impact and enter dialogue in at different levels, but reality is it's something we do city by city. But of course also always trying to sort of bring the experiences we've had, also the results, the data, what can we actually provide with the city, to have that dialogue with the city. But it's there's no quick fix, unfortunately.
There was one more question here. Maybe the last question before we wrap up.
Hello. One of the first things I noticed in the first presentation was that America was in the yellow color. Everyone loves their cars, everyone loves to get around. And I've always said that Europe kind of leads, or in the mobility space at least, it definitely leads America in terms of regulation, sustainability, and having more of a sustainable system here. So my question is, what aspects of the European mobility market do you guys seek can be replicated in America to increase sustainability over there?
Maybe Silvia, you can.
The follow-up can be, kind of what are your opinions of what America should do to increase sustainability?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, that's a tough one. I mean, the first thing I noticed when I came to the US for the first time is the absence of public transportation, obviously. Yeah? So everyone has a big own car. And let's face it, I mean, in the city, there would be a lot of potential for public transportation systems and environments. And I know this is also a topic that is being discussed. However, it's an expensive one and complicated one. Honestly, I'm not really an expert on this topic, yeah? But that's certainly one of the key levers. The other one is shared mobility, and there I think a lot is happening in the US actually. Yeah? So you also see the rise of micromobility and all kind of sharing systems. Mobility as a service, similarly, is a system that is being rolled out in the United States. But other than that, I think it's a lot about mindset and education as well. Yeah? So my perception always is that in Europe, the dialogue around sustainability is a little bit more advanced, or maybe at least in more areas of the society. Whereas in the US, you have very different streams still. And I think talking about it, I mean, we heard the climate activist this morning with a very strong speech. We've seen that a lot in Europe in the last years even. Yeah? Fridays for Future, very present. And I think that's the right discussion to have. And probably that would be very effective as well over there.
Maybe I'll add to that one point on the tension between public and private. So obviously the US has evolved, right, through history, through world wars and recoveries and crises, through propelling the economy by creating huge infrastructure projects that were surrounding transportation, particularly the car. And we've seen the results of that, even socioeconomic results of having entire roadways, siloing, ghettoing entire populations and so on. So it's a very big theme, and I think a lot of people are recognizing this in the US, transportation being at the backbone of social unrest, and it's great. One thing that I would perhaps consider is flagging that what we used to call a private car, the symbol. I think we talked about it before, sort of the symbol of freedom and so on, and public transit, which is the symbol of unsuccessfulness, even in some ways. We should break it down. It's not public or private. Actually, cars that we use on the roads are responsible for much of taxpayers' money expenses that the government is taking. It's the roads, it's the streetlights, it's maintenance, it's a lot. So it's not quite true to call a private car private and a public transport public. We should blend these, we should forget these 20th century terms and move to the 21st century and say, well, everything is partially paid by us through our taxpayers' money and directly, and partially paid by other people around us, and therefore every choice we make in terms of mobility has a consequence on everyone, and we can control it better. And I think that would be really helpful in the context of the US specifically, where individualism and consumerism and ownership are fundamental to the perception of oneself.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for your questions and for your answers. As we're coming to an end of this discussion, I'd love to ask all of you one last question here. If you look into the future and the next couple of years, what is this one thing that you would expect to see from the people, but also one thing that you would commit to doing as either an operator or someone working with governments or on other projects? Who would like to start?
I can give it a start. I have actually two things that I want to point out. One is, and I would ask every one of you and me myself as well, I mean, use these offers, yeah, go sustainably, yeah, go green, yeah, whenever you have the choice, take the right one, yeah, because I think it's our shared responsibility. But in general, I think what needs to happen, and that would be my call out, is that we need to collaborate just much more, yeah, so we should just work really closely together towards creating solutions. We should closely work together publicly and privately. We should stop this competitive mindset, but really, yeah, generate more interfaces, more openness, more collaboration, and provide all the necessary access point to facilitate that necessary transition.
Thank you.
So for me, wearing the World Economic Forum's hat, I intend to continue to provide these platforms or create even new platform for networking, for interaction between public and private and various private, right? It's not just one sector anymore. It's various sectors that are now being combined. So please do reach out if you're sitting here and you feel that you want to be part of that conversation. And as a personally, I intend to continue to look at every transportation opportunity that I have walking out of my house as a journey. It's a surprise. So I'm not going to go into a car. I don't own a car. I'm actually going to choose whatever I choose, and things will happen. I'll meet new people. Exciting things can happen. And if you wear that mindset, I think it would, I welcome you all to sort of try to look at it that way too. Maybe that make the choices easier.
Okay, thank you.
To me, I think we can all agree that the goal is to create more sustainability in our mobility choices. So it's really just about doing it, actually acting on it. We all are experts at finding the roadblocks and complications. Talking about before with charging infrastructure, parking. These are solvable because there are so many great examples of it. So it's really acting. And I think we all here, we are biased towards shared mobility and sustainable mobility. So we all have an obligation of spreading that word and sharing the experiences that we have to impact.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, dear panelists. Thank you all for listening. And yeah, have a great rest of the day.